My sermon today is titled Animals and Research. Where do we draw the line? And first I wanted to just point out some advances that human beings have enjoyed that used animals to meet those advances. So some critical research using animals includes establishing germ theory. Think about germ theory. Germ theory is the theory that we can get sick because of little microorganisms that we can't see, and that they can infect our cells and cause damage to us. Establishing this very important scientific theory that is kind of the basis of a lot of medicine was done by Louis Pasteur and Koch in the 1800s. And they used animals to establish that theory. We would not know about that if we'd never started testing on animals unless we tested on humans. In the late 1800s, we controlled diphtheria, which was a really big problem for children. And we significantly reduced mortality in children due to our accomplishments in using animals to find out what was going on with diphtheria, this disease that was so devastating. Some of you might remember polio. In the mid-1900s, polio was a really, really big deal. It's caused by a virus. And they used monkeys to develop the vaccine that kind of changed everything to do with getting polio. Testing medications for bacterial contaminants depends today all the time on using horseshoe crab blood. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Learning about attachment theory, which is, as far as I know, critical to understanding trauma. That depended a lot on some research you guys would probably be horrified by on Harlow's monkeys in the 1970s. I don't know how critical you guys think space travel is, but before we sent humans up into space, we tried out sending a lot of animals into space. I have Tim and I used to collect shot glasses. We don't anymore because we don't drink anymore, but we had a series of shot glasses, and I can only find one in our house, but it's a series of shot glasses about the animals that we send into space. And the one that we could find is Laika, who was a Samoyed Terrier mixed dog. And he was launched into space, into orbit, November 3rd, 1957. On Sputnik 2, he went up 660 kilometers. His name was Kurdyavaka. Little curly is what that means. And he was the first animal sent into orbit. Do you think we brought him back? We didn't. We sent lots of animals into space to make sure that it was safe for humans to do so, and we didn't bring them back. The development of vaccines that are meant to take care of your pets. So, the rabies vaccine, which isn't just to take care of pets, it's also to protect humans from rabies. The heartworm vaccines, like for the medications that they use. All these had to be tested on animals to make sure they were safe. The COVID vaccine, do you think we moved straight from doing the lab stuff straight into testing on humans? We did not. We'll talk about that in a minute. So those are some of the things that I would argue most of us find to be critical in today's world to being a human being, except maybe the space thing. And I wanted to talk specifically about the COVID vaccine and treatment studies. There is an organization called the Americans for Medical Progress, AMP, and they work to protect society's investment in research by nurturing public understanding of and support humane, necessary, and valuable use of animals in medicine. And I found on their website a list of hundreds of publications just in the last year and a half that report results from studies using animals to develop and test vaccines and treatments for COVID. So this is ongoing research. Some of I didn't look into every article, but some of them have the name of the organisms and title that they used. So llamas, mice, monkeys, different types of monkeys and non-human primates, hamsters, alpacas, zebrafish. These are all animals that we're using to better understand COVID and ways to treat COVID and in the production of vaccines that I might guess everybody in here has benefited from. Pfizer, Moderna, and J&J all did the standard animal testing before moving on to human trials. We would never put something in humans we hadn't already tested on animals. Some people, were claiming that we didn't do any animal testing, and that was one reason they claimed that the vaccine wasn't safe. But that's not true. We did do animal testing on all 3 of the vaccines available in the United States. Okay, so I bet a lot of you haven't thought before about things such as the flu shot or the pacemaker or joint replacement or pet rabies vaccines, injectable drugs, syringes, intravenous solutions, implantable medical devices for both human and animals. They have to be tested to make sure there's no bacterial contaminants on them before we put them into your bodies. So chemotherapy infusions, and if anybody has a hip replacement or knee replacement or pacemaker. This today all depends, the safety of those things all depends on our use of something called a horseshoe crab. So we have a specimen from Morningside University of a what do you call this, an exoskeleton of a horseshoe crab. It's not a whole organism, but we do have a whole organism in a bucket that Tim offered to bring in, dead and preserved. But this organism, which you're welcome to look at, you can find on beaches, and they come onto the beaches to mate. And what we do is when they come onto these beaches in huge numbers, we go collect them, and we drain them of a lot of their blood. The reason we do that is because we used to test whether these things were contaminated with bunnies. We used to give bunnies the medications or the implants or whatever and see over a period of time whether they developed any infections. That takes time, it takes bunnies. With the horseshoe crabs, we can bleed them, and they have this really cool aspect of their blood. Their blood is blue, and it has the ability to encapsulate bacteria. Okay? And it changes, so you can very quickly and easily tell whether something that you expose to this blood is contaminated with bacteria, the endotoxins from bacteria. We think of this as a non-invasive way to do things because we bleed them and then we let them go. But a lot of studies have shown that they don't just live easily after you bleed them from of a lot of blood, and some of them don't even survive the process of bleeding them. But it was thought to be more humane and easier and quicker, and we do this all the time. This is standard practice for checking on safety of all kinds of things. Back to vaccine development, we have used non-human primates for a lot of our research. Non-human primates, if you look in the literature, they actually abbreviate this as NHPs, make it sound very removed. But they tend to be used for things like vaccine development because they're so similar to us, right? So there's this double-edged sword. We need to test on things that are similar to us to know best whether it's going to hurt us to use these things. But at the same time, when we recognize ourselves in organisms, people tend to go, I don't want you to do animal research on these guys. So there have been fights for a long time about especially using chimpanzees in medical research. Chimpanzees are our closest living relatives. And Jane Goodall was instrumental in bringing to light how similar they are to us in our emotions and our intelligence and things like that. And actually, I was surprised. So Francis Collins in, let's see, I didn't write it here down. 2015, I'm pretty sure. there was a PBS interview with Francis Collins, who was the director of NIH at the time, and they decided that the National Institute of Health, NIH, would no longer fund research on biomedical research for human health in chimpanzees. And we have a lot of chimps still in labs, and they established, actually, I remember when I was in undergrad, my advisor, Bill McGrew, studied chimpanzees in the wild, and he was part of establishing this place called Chimp Haven, where they now send any chimpanzees. In 2015, they sent a lot of the chimpanzees that were still in labs to Chimp Haven, which is just a kind of a refuge for chimps that used to be in captivity for medical testing. So we're not allowed to test on chimps anymore. So there's a line, right, that we've decided exists. But, you know, it's a good question. Does that line go further than chimps? What else are we totally uncomfortable with testing on? So that comes to the question of whether animal use is justified at all. So does it depend on the species that we're studying, whether you think animal use is justified? And can we draw a line below which using animals is okay? So I was talking to my good friend Chuck Polk at UK. Oh my God, okay. Chuck Fox was an ecologist at UK, and my good friend today is Chuck Polk at, where do I work? With. I was at UK for a long time doing my PhD, but I'm at Whit now. So Chuck Polk teaches a class on ethics, and they have a segment on ethics of animal use. And he pointed me in the direction of this guy who lived in the 1700s, Jeremy Bentham, who was a critical philosopher. And he said, I found this quote, "The day may come when the non-human part of the animal creation will acquire the rights that never could have been withheld from them except by the hand of tyranny. The French," this is 1700s, "the French have already discovered that the blackness of the skin is no reason why human beings should be abandoned without redress to the whims of a tormentor. Perhaps it will someday be recognized that the number of legs, the hairiness of the skin, or the possession of a tail are equally insufficient reasons for abandoning to the same fate a creature that can feel. What else could be used to draw the line? Is it the faculty of reason or the possession of language? But a full-grown horse or dog is incomparably more rational and conversable than an infant of a day or a week or even a month old. Even if that were not so, what difference would that make? The question is not, can they reason or can they talk, but can they suffer? So in creating this talk that I'm giving today, I was trying to think about the different aspects of animals that you might use to argue whether research is okay to do on them or not. And Jeremy Bentham brings us to the idea of suffering. And I, in thinking about this, actually divide suffering into two types. One is psychological suffering. And when we're thinking about this one, we're thinking about what we value. We're thinking about how we value happiness, we value freedom. And when we do not have, as humans, happiness or freedom, we suffer psychologically. Now, this argument requires cognition and awareness, maybe intelligence, so that you're aware psychologically that you are not having happiness or freedom. So this is where you might be kind of disgusted by the idea of doing research on monkeys, where you deprive them of their mother and watch how they suffer and in what ways they suffer, not having a mother around as they develop. I would argue there's another kind of suffering that doesn't depend on cognition or intelligence or awareness, and that would be psychological or physiological suffering. All animals have stress response. All animals feel pain to some degree. I mean, we could argue about what pain is, but if pain is a sensory mechanism to detect damage to your cells and to your body, It requires sensory system. It requires maybe a nervous system, maybe endocrine systems like hormones that you're putting around in your body. And we know that stress hormones modify things like your immune function. You get sicker when you're stressed more often. Animals, when we bring them into the lab and we test, like fish, and we test to see whether certain contaminants in the water that they're experiencing, we do something called an LD50 test. And we see how much contaminant does it take to kill 50% of the animals. That number, if we just test like a particular chemical, and that's all they're experiencing, that number is higher. That LD50 takes more contaminant to kill them to 50% than if they have an additional stressor. So maybe you have a predator present, and they can detect there's this predator present. That causes stress, and when they feel stress, they succumb more to environmental contaminants and other types of stress. This is called multiple stressors. And so part of this is, how do we recognize physiological pain in other animals? The closer they are to us, the easier it is for us to say, oh my God, that animal's in pain. So like a dog. I would say that most of us who have dogs can recognize when our dogs are in pain, but they're mammals, right? Start talking about grasshoppers or horseshoe crabs. We can't tell by looking at them that they are in pain. We can imagine, we can empathize, but we can do studies where we collect their blood and test their stress hormone levels. And we have done this. And things like crabs have an increased stress hormone level when you pick them up. They think you're a predator and they're nervous about this. And if you're doing chronic stress to them, they're not going to live as long. They're not going to have as many mates. They're not going to be as healthy. We can have unintended death. And here we're valuing inherent worth, the right to survive. If you think about whether animals have the right to survive, well, which animals have the right to survive? When you are outside and a stupid, minute parrot bug lands on you and bites you, you feel very free to just zap that sucker. He hurt you. So you see a cockroach in your kitchen, well, that's not okay, so we step on it, right? We don't think twice about this, really, most of us. I mean, there are definitely cultures that do think twice about it, but I would argue that in most American cultures, if you go to a restaurant where there's a cockroach, you're probably going to kill that guy, right? Because it's a threat to human health. But we can do things to animals and have unintended, even death consequences for them, such as the horseshoe crabs, bleeding them can lead to death. But we can also think about value in terms of how important a species is to the ecosystem. So if we value ecosystem functioning, then we might draw that line at different places. And maybe it's not the bunnies that we care so much about not doing research on, because maybe they're not that key. But starfish, you remove starfish and the whole ecosystem collapses. You remove insects, pollinators. You have huge consequences to ecosystems. They're not that cute, right? That's my another point, another reason which all the kids had, right? The reason they chose those species not to do research on was because we love them. They're cute, they're beautiful, they're cool, they're majestic. Is that a good reason to choose some animals to do research on and not other animals? I'd say that the value we're placing there is on human companionship, beauty, cuteness. So here we're talking about our kind of innate repulsion at doing research on dogs, cats, horses, hamsters, guinea pigs. Another thing is economic value in other ways. Ella said, I don't want to do research on pigs because I like to eat them, right? So some species we use as economic things. We use them as resources for eating or for wool, right? So you might have a sort of repulsion at the idea of doing research on pigs or cattle or sheep or llamas or goats or chicken or turkeys. Might be okay to eat, but maybe not to do research on. We might decide we don't want to do research on some species because they're like us, and we recognize our humanity in them. We need to link these to our UU principles. So the first principle is the inherent worth and dignity of every person. That's what we believe in. What is a person? If you have a cat or a dog as your pet in your home, do you consider it a person? Or is this necessarily human? What about justice, equity, and compassion in human relations? I'd say a lot of times we base our ideas as to whether it's okay to test on something on our compassion or our empathy for those creatures. The other really obvious one is the respect for the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are a part. That's the second principle. Is that clock right?
No.
What time is it? I want to read an excerpt from the Case for Animal Rights by Tom Reagan, which is another philosopher that Chuck pointed me in the direction of. What's wrong, fundamentally wrong with the way animals are treated isn't the details that vary from case to case. It's the whole system. The forlornness of the veal calf is pathetic, heart-wrenching. The pulsing pain of the chimp with electrodes planted deep in her brain is repulsive. The slow, tortuous death of the raccoon caught in the leg rope trap is agonizing. But what is wrong isn't the pain, isn't the suffering, isn't the deprivation. These compound what's wrong. Sometimes, often, they make it much, much worse. But they are not the fundamental wrong. The fundamental wrong is the system that allows us to view animals as our resources. Here for us, to be eaten or surgically manipulated or exploited for sport or money. Once we accept this view of animals as our resources, the rest is as predictable as it is regrettable. Why worry about their loneliness, their pain, their death? Since animals exist for us, to benefit us in one way or another, what harms them really doesn't matter. Or matters only if it starts to bother us, make us feel a trifle uneasy when we eat our veal, for example. So yes, let us get veal calves out of solitary confinement. Give them more space, a little straw, a few companions, but let us keep our veal. The first principle, Dr. Rebecca M. Parker has a reflection on, and I think this speaks to this. So she says, the reverence and respect for human nature is at the core of Unitarian Universalist faith. We believe that all the dimensions of our being carry the potential to do good. We celebrate the gifts of being human, our intelligence, our capacity for observation and reason, our senses and ability to appreciate beauty or creativity, our feelings and emotions. We cherish our bodies as well as our souls. We can use our gifts to offer love, to work for justice, to heal injury, to create pleasure for ourselves and others. There are animals that are intelligent, have the capacity for observation and reason, that have senses, all animals have senses, and ability to appreciate beauty. Our feelings, animals have feelings. Consider them to be physiological sensations. Right? So you might argue that our first principle applies to anything that fits those parameters. As UUs, we value all human life and have respect for all life. However, do we value human life over other species? Do we believe we have dominion over other species? Christianity, they think about dominion to use animals as resources, but they also think about being stewards of God's creations with obligations to protect and speak for those who cannot speak. I would argue that our principles oblige us to use animals to better human lives, but our principles also require that we use animals responsibly. The trick is determining what this means, which starts with each of us gaining awareness and examining our own values. Only then can we responsibly pursue medical advances and also fight for laws that enact respect for non-human animals as in our 7 principles. This would be the balance that we want to work toward.